The sinking of the RMS Lusitania on May 7, 1915, remains one of the most dramatic and tragic events of the First World War, marking a pivotal moment in both maritime history and international relations. It was a day when a passenger liner, once thought invulnerable, became the victim of a ruthless attack that would change the course of history. As the Lusitania sailed through the cold, dark waters off the coast of Ireland, few could have imagined that within a matter of hours, the luxurious ocean liner would be reduced to wreckage, and nearly 1,200 souls would be lost to the sea. The events surrounding the sinking unfolded with shocking speed, and the consequences would reverberate throughout the world. The Lusitania was one of the largest and most opulent ships of its time, a symbol of modern engineering and the golden age of transatlantic travel. Owned by the Cunard Line, the Lusitania had been launched in 1906 and had quickly become a favorite among wealthy travelers crossing the Atlantic. With its luxurious first-class accommodations, fine dining, and unparalleled amenities, the ship was a beacon of the lavishness of Edwardian society. On board, the passengers were a mix of aristocrats, businessmen, tourists, and a number of high-profile figures. There was a sense of excitement and expectation as the ship left the port of New York on May 1, bound for Liverpool, England. Little did they know that this would be their final voyage, and the world would soon change forever. On the morning of May 7, as the Lusitania sailed through the calm waters of the North Atlantic, it was largely business as usual on board. Passengers were enjoying breakfast in the grand dining room, some taking in the fresh air on deck, others chatting with fellow travelers in the lounges. The ship had been cruising for several days now, and most of the passengers felt safe, secure in the belief that they were on one of the most advanced and well-guarded ships in the world. At the time, there was no clear understanding of the full scope of the dangers posed by German U-boats, which were a relatively new weapon in the naval arsenal of the warring powers. The Lusitania had already traveled through waters that were known to be risky, but there had been no major incidents, and the crew was confident in their ability to navigate the danger. In the radio room, where the ship's wireless operators were busy sending messages, a sense of unease had begun to settle in. Several ships had reported sightings of German U-boats, and there had been warnings issued about the increased risk of attack. But these were dismissed by many as the overblown fears of a few. The Lusitania was an enormous vessel, and its speed and firepower were thought to make it nearly invincible. Even though the British Admiralty had issued a warning advising ships to take precautions while crossing the Atlantic, few on board took the threat seriously. The prevailing belief was that the Lusitania, as a passenger vessel, was too important to be attacked, and that Germany would not risk provoking a major international incident by sinking such a prominent ship. Yet, unbeknownst to those aboard, the threat was far more imminent than anyone could have anticipated. As the day wore on, the ship continued its course, cutting through the water at nearly 25 knots. The passengers were enjoying the day's luxuries, some attending a concert in the lounge, others engaged in lively conversation over drinks or in the dining room. The sun shone brightly over the sea, and the deck was alive with the sounds of laughter and chatter. There was no hint that this was about to be the Lusitania's final day at sea. For all intents and purposes, it seemed like just another day on the ocean, a day that would soon be irrevocably altered by a single moment of violence. At precisely 2:10 p.m., the Lusitania was struck by a single torpedo fired from the German U-boat U-20, which had been lurking beneath the waves, patiently awaiting its target. The torpedo struck the ship's starboard side, just below the waterline, creating an explosion that reverberated throughout the ship. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. A massive section of the ship's hull was torn apart, and the ship shuddered violently as it was thrown off course. The force of the explosion was so great that it sent a shockwave through the entire vessel, causing windows to shatter, doors to burst open, and metal to twist and buckle. Passengers who were dining in the ship's lavish first-class restaurant were tossed from their seats, and the once serene and elegant ship suddenly became a scene of pandemonium. In the first few moments following the explosion, many passengers were unaware of the true scale of the disaster. Some initially thought the blast was merely a mechanical failure, others assumed it was just a minor accident. But the reality soon became clear. The Lusitania was sinking, and sinking fast. As the crew rushed to assess the damage, it became evident that the torpedo had caused a fatal breach in the hull. The ship's engines were disabled, and water was rapidly flooding the lower decks. The order was given to prepare the lifeboats, but the ship was listing heavily to starboard, making it difficult to launch them in an orderly fashion. Panic began to spread throughout the ship as the realization dawned on passengers and crew alike that survival was not guaranteed. In the radio room, the wireless operators immediately began sending out distress signals, hoping to alert nearby ships to the catastrophe. But the response was slow, and the Lusitania's position was unclear. The radio operators continued to send frantic messages, but they were not receiving the help they needed. Meanwhile, on deck, passengers scrambled to put on life jackets and make their way to the lifeboats. Many were already in shock, unable to process the suddenness of the attack and the catastrophic damage to the ship. As the ship began to tilt at a dangerous angle, passengers found it increasingly difficult to move around. The weight of the ship's luxury furnishings, combined with the suddenness of the disaster, made the already chaotic situation even more terrifying. The lifeboats that were launched were quickly filled to capacity, and the cries of those left behind echoed across the deck. Those who could not find a place in the boats were left to cling to pieces of debris or to jump into the frigid waters below. The cold of the North Atlantic combined with the panic of the situation made for a terrifying and desperate struggle for survival. In the midst of the chaos, there were acts of heroism, as crew members and passengers alike worked to help those around them. But there were also moments of selfishness, as people shoved their way onto lifeboats, pushing others aside in the desperate hope of saving themselves. As the Lusitania continued its descent into the sea, the ship's stern rose higher and higher, looming ominously above the waves. Within 18 minutes of the torpedo strike, the Lusitania was gone, disappearing beneath the surface of the Atlantic. What had been one of the largest and most luxurious ships in the world was now a wreck on the ocean floor. The lifeboats that had managed to launch bobbed in the water, surrounded by debris and the remnants of the ship. The ocean was eerily quiet after the tumultuous scenes of the past hour, save for the occasional cry of a survivor and the sound of the waves. Of the nearly 2,000 people aboard, only about 760 survived. The rest were lost to the sea, their fates sealed in a tragic and brutal moment of wartime violence. Among the dead were many women and children, as well as numerous prominent figures, including the American philanthropist Alfred G. Vanderbilt. The loss of so many lives, particularly those of non-combatants, sent shockwaves through the world. News of the sinking spread quickly, and in the aftermath, questions began to mount about the legality and morality of attacking civilian targets during wartime. The sinking of the Lusitania provoked outrage in neutral countries, particularly the United States, which had so far tried to stay out of the conflict. Many Americans viewed the attack as an unjustifiable act of barbarism, and public opinion began to shift against Germany. The event also had profound diplomatic consequences. In the wake of the attack, the German government defended the actions of the U-boat crew, arguing that the Lusitania had been carrying munitions and that it had been a legitimate military target. However, this claim was met with widespread skepticism. While the Lusitania did carry some war materials in its cargo, it was primarily a passenger ship, and the majority of those aboard were civilians. The idea of sinking a civilian vessel without warning was seen as a breach of the accepted rules of warfare, and it stirred international condemnation. The attack helped galvanize support for the Allies, particularly in the United States, and it played a significant role in the eventual decision of President Woodrow Wilson to join the war on the side of the Allies in 1917. The sinking of the Lusitania was more than just a tragic maritime disaster. It was a turning point in the history of the First World War, marking a shift in the way naval warfare would be conducted. The use of U-boats, previously seen as an unconventional and limited form of warfare, would become a central element of naval strategy throughout the war. The attack also marked a shift in public attitudes towards the war. The violence and brutality of the sinking, coupled with the high number of civilian casualties, made the war seem more personal, more immediate, and more horrifying for those who had previously been distant from the conflict. In the years that followed, the sinking of the Lusitania would continue to echo throughout history. It became a symbol of the brutal realities of war, especially for those who had once thought that such violence could never touch the lives of ordinary civilians. The tragedy shaped public opinion and helped pave the way for greater international scrutiny of warfare and its human cost. It also left a deep scar on the families of the victims, whose loss would never be fully accounted for or healed. As for the Lusitania itself, it would remain a lasting reminder of the fragile line between peace and war, of how quickly and violently the world could change. Though the immediate aftermath of the disaster saw diplomatic tensions rise, the event also led to important changes in naval policy, particularly regarding the treatment of passenger vessels during wartime. The outrage over the attack on a civilian ship contributed to a growing sentiment that unrestricted submarine warfare, in which German U-boats targeted any and all shipping, was untenable and could not be allowed to continue without consequences. This shift in attitude, along with the mounting pressures on neutral nations, eventually played a role in the United States' decision to enter the war in 1917, a move that would significantly alter the course of the conflict. The memory of the Lusitania would linger long after the war ended, as a haunting reminder of the human toll that wars take not just on soldiers, but on those who are caught in the crossfire, far from the front lines. The sinking of the Lusitania was a defining moment of the First World War, marking the end of an era of innocence for many and opening the door to a new age of brutal, all-encompassing conflict. The shock and sorrow that gripped the world in the wake of the disaster would not fade quickly. Even as nations rebuilt, as governments shifted and alliances changed, the tragedy of the Lusitania would remain a symbol of the cost of war, of the lives lost, the families shattered, and the global community forever altered by the forces of destruction. If you found this account of the Lusitania moving or insightful, please consider subscribing for more historical stories, in-depth analyses, and narrative accounts of pivotal events. Stay informed, and continue exploring the stories that have shaped our world.